Hello, welcome to the live show. My name is Bret. This is my channel. I've been here forever. We're going to be here forever, at least until they shut us down and prevent us from streaming on YouTube. Thank you so much for being here. This is, if you're watching it live, this is Docker and DevOps. Really, it's anything cloud native, anything containers. You know, my jam is containers for 10 years now. I won't shut up about it. So thanks for being here. I'm excited. We got Dan on the show. We're going to get right to all the good stuff. I've even wearing my Argo shirt today. We're all in on the Argo and GitOps conversations today. But real quick, give you some announcements. The monthly hangout that we have on our Discord server. Did you know we have a Discord server? It's right there. DevOps.fan. 14,000 people in there, all talking about DevOps all the time. I can't even keep up anymore with the conversation. So thank you to those who hang out in that community, help others. I'm really excited how that community's grown, and you all just took it over and ran with it. We now have Swarm meetups, the alternate to Kubernetes. So we have Swarm meetups every other month there. We have now a monthly hangout where if you're into DevOps or you're a DevOps professional or you want to learn from others that are doing the work, it's like a water cooler lunch hangout thing we do every month. That's the High Fivers. The way you get access to that is to become a member of this channel at the High Fivers Club. It's basically a quality filter. So the people that want to be serious and want to talk about serious things, you can go check that out over here. This is our Discord server. Right above me is the link if you didn't know about it. And hello to all you that came today from the Discord Hangouts. And we have events happening. So the nice thing is in here we have events. You can actually look at the list. Today we're talking all about CodeFresh and GitOps. We've got the High Fivers next month. We got a Swarm fans coming up. We're talking about other events. So several of you from the community have offered to try to help create Discord-focused events where we're on video, we're maybe presenting. It's a low-risk environment. It's much easier to do that than it is a talk at a conference or something like that. No CFPs required. Reach out to me in the Discord server if you're interested in that. Maybe we'll set something up. Maybe we'll have a couple events there. What else? We've got, this turns into a podcast. Did you know that? This podcast comes out about a month later. Get in all your podcast players. Just look up my name or DevOps and Docker Talk or something like that. It's a very long title now. I put every possible buzzword in the title of the podcast so that the algorithms would pick it up. And sadly, this week, Nirmal's not with me, but he will be back, I believe, next week. And we will have another show next week as well. We just finished, speaking of DevOps and GitOps, the Kubernetes automation live cohort workshop thingy I do. And it's 2 weeks long. You've probably heard me talk about it. We're just about ready to announce the next cohort, maybe in September, maybe in November. We're not really sure. We might do both. But you can get on the waiting list, basically, and find out all about the new times we're going to do that. It's live only in Zoom. We just had another dozen people go through that, and they gave us some nice ratings. So I really appreciate that. Thank you all. And that was a lot of fun. I love hanging out in Zoom, learning about people's problems, helping them with automation and all these tools. And there's a bunch of other stuff, but let's just get to it. Let's just have some fun. Dan, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Brett. I'm excited to be with you and hang out. And I was just tweeting that you're like kind of a legend, and the community owes you a lot because of how many trainings you've done. There's so many people who are in this space now thanks to your bootstrapping and teaching them the ropes, and that's like pretty awesome to be with you.
Well, thank you. And today is awesome, Dan. We were just talking before the show. If you didn't know who this gentleman was, I met him like 5 or 6 years ago. I was very lucky. I was actually introduced to him, I think, by someone else who told me he was awesome. His Twitter handle is awesome, so you got to go check him out on Twitter. He talks about this stuff all day long. So Dan Garfield is the co-founder and now the chief open source officer at CodeFresh. And you talk about open source all the time. You're all over the internet. When I search you on YouTube, you're there a lot. And you're not just on your channel. Yeah. You're on all the channels. You're on everyone else's channels.
Yeah.
You have conference talks. You do GitOps conferences. We were just talking about that before the show. I'm ready to get into it. I'm excited. We could talk for 5 hours, but.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I was thinking you brought up when we met back in LA, and it was kind of a group of who's who would become really important in this space. And I think we had all these different characters, and Jerome was like, he was like playing on a beat machine or something. It was like, it was a very LA moment. I felt, like a celebrity. So it was nice.
LA moment. Yeah. Cause you had a former actress with, Chloe Condon sitting there, and then you had Jerome playing music while we were listening to a music at an event. Like there was like a DJ there, but someone else had the DJ at the table we were at, and that was a fun conference. It was not too huge, right? It wasn't 10,000 people, so you could still find your friends. That was a good time.
Yeah, those classic. I mean, KubeCon, DockerCon. Gosh, I got a lot of stories going back in the days to those, but. I'm pretty interested in your Argo training, and it seems like that's been super interesting for people. You've had a lot of interest in Argo.
Yeah, I mean, and that all happened out of the fact that I kept getting consulting clients that were either wanting to use Argo, or they definitely wanted GitOps, but if they were choosing a tool, they were probably choosing Argo. I'm not anti-Flux or anti-anything. I think all these tools are great, and we're still, I feel like, very early days in terms of what GitOps means in terms of tooling. But Argo felt like it was sort of winning the marketing game, or the hearts, the love of people. Maybe I think it's partly the UI is pretty on point. And so I thought, well, if they're all running it and they want more of it, maybe I should help people with it. But the challenge with GitOps, I feel like, is that it's kind of like this whole automation game, and why you have a company is that there's a lot in the middle. There's a lot of complexity and a lot of decisions, and I realize it's hard to put that in a course, right? Like it's pretty hard to give people specific implementation guidance when everyone's so different in the way that their workflows are and their human processes are. And so that's how it became a live course.
So many assumptions built in to like how people operate. And so many people are coming at this from a Jenkins world. And it's for example, we work on, in the Argo project, we've got Argo workflows for doing workflow engine in Kubernetes. We've got Argo CD for doing GitOps. We've got Argo rollouts for doing progressive delivery. So we have all these different projects. And all of these people hear about Argo being really good for deploying software. And they show up and they look at the web page, the homepage of Argo, and I'll put it up for you. And they see that there's these 4 projects, and they're like, oh, which one of these things should I use to deploy? And a lot of people actually just grab Argo workflows, because they're like, oh, that kind of looks like CI/CD. I'm used to that. So I'll start using this. And I talk to people all the time who are like, yeah, I'm building my deployments using Argo workflows. And when I drill down with them, it's because they heard Argo was really good at that. And I'm like, do you think maybe it was about Argo CD? Because you can like define a source of truth and have it sync and deploy. And very quickly I see teams kind of be like, oh, workflows is cool for its own thing, but I'm actually kind of using it for the wrong thing, just because I'm coming from CI/CD and I'm thinking about workflow engine, CI pipeline, and extending that to deliver software. So that is like a kind of a funny little, like, people get stuck in that mindset.
Yeah. In fact, just because I'm lucky enough to have some of the co-founders of the project back when it was at Intuit and pre-Intuit, the Argo project did, I believe, start with workflows. And the story I've been told is like workflows, they realized that they needed a more specific implementation of workflows for the deployment aspect, because we've all been pushing from Jenkins and all the other CIs for so long, running kube control apply in bash scripts, that it took a team that had a big, huge problem to try to figure out how do we make this a little more resilient. And of course, you had Weave at the same time figuring this out. It's like everybody was coalescing on this same problem of Kubernetes is awesome. It solved a lot of problems, but the one thing that isn't awesome is having to type a command to deploy updates. We need something a little more robust, right?
So the way Argo started goes back to a guy named Pratik who started this company, Applatix, and their goal was to make a workflow engine that was Kubernetes native. And I wasn't working directly with them at that time, but we were both based in Mountain View. We were talking to each other. My co-founder, Raziel, who's the CEO of CodeFresh, was good friends with Pratik and some of the other members of the team. So we were very aware of each other and talking to each other, and they were showing off what they were building. And they were saying, look, we're building this workflow engine for Kubernetes. This is really interesting. And what was kind of at the time, I looked at it and I thought, this isn't really like, there are a lot of things about this that for CI are not necessarily ideal, that are kind of more work than you would need them to be for kind of the primitives that were set up. But it was very interesting, and we thought, that's kind of cool. And so they were starting to try to commercialize it, not really finding the market. And on the flip side, Intuit came along and they said, this is really fantastic for handling data pipelines. Like, we can handle really large data sets. We can take advantage of our Kubernetes infrastructure to do this stuff. And so they adopted it for that, and they acquired Applatix. And right after acquisition, the team was saying, we need a really good way to get these workflows onto the cluster. And we're always going back and checking them into Git. And then we have to build it's like, well, we have to have a pipeline to push it, but that doesn't really make sense, because really we're just trying to keep things in sync. And so this is where Argo CD started. And it was it basically launched from Intuit. And Intuit at the time, we were looking at, we were actually getting ready to launch a commercial version of Argo CD, and starting to work on the project and do contributions. And they said, we really, Intuit said, we're not going to ever commercialize this. This is something that we use for us. And we want people that can come in and help run this project. And so our CodeFresh joined, then Red Hat joined, and pretty soon we had, between BlackRock was a part of it. So between the 4 companies, we had really good, maintenance and focus on this project to go take it forward and launch it. And so we got it into the CNCF and got it into graduation path. And
I was going to say it worked.
Finally. Yeah, it worked.
It worked. I mean, graduating from CNCF is no small feat, right? Like, having the healthy community, having the healthy maintainers, having the customer evidence, I think, is one of the requirements, right? Like, having showing that it's solving people's problems and not just a solution looking for a problem. Pretty awesome.
Yeah, yeah. So we're pretty happy about that, and that story and that growth, and now we've got. I mean, you can look on our site, and we've got, I think, what's our public, our community is huge. We've got 200 officially, adopted companies in this list. We've got Google in there. We've got, the Teslas and all those
the
folks.
Adobes. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been, really cool. And now we've got ArgoCon. The first ArgoCon we did a few years ago, we had, I want to say we had 8,000 people online for that. I mean, it was the first one we did, and it was just nuts. So yeah, there's definitely been a huge response from the community, and a lot of love for Argo and Argo CD and Argo workflows. We just had a report come out. We did a survey of users, and Argo's NPS was 85, which, if you're not familiar with NPS score, it's Net Promoter Score. Basically, you ask people, how likely, you always get those surveys, how likely are you to recommend this to a friend? And anybody that's 8, 9, or 10 is considered a promoter. Anybody that's less than 7 is considered a detractor. They actually don't like your product. That's how they count it.
Okay.
And then you take the net of those and you score it. And so the iPhone has a score of 65. It's that's really good. And and a company like Comcast, not to pick on them, but it's negative. It's negative 60.
Well, it's easy to pick on when they're that low. So yeah.
So that's kind of the range of it. And so Argo CDs being 85 is that's it's what you can found a religion on, Okay. So that's really good. That's how good it is.
Wow. I like that. I certainly am a fan of the GitOps religion. I think it was pretty early. I actually learned Flux first because I learned about GitOps from Weave, and which I still sort of use their GitOps guide. It's a pretty good one, and I give that to people. I'm like, if you're confused, because there are other companies, I'm not going to name names, but a company that has labs in their name, they seem to have the different wrong definitions. So I thought it would be good for us, while we're constantly talking about this, you have it up on screen, I have it up on screen. Let me just throw it up real quick. You were a co-founder, I believe, of the Open GitOps stuff, right?
Yeah.
You were, and this was, to me, a very significant departure from the mistakes of the past. And I wrote about this in my newsletter recently, that one of the challenges with us being in DevOps is that it means whatever you want it to mean to anyone, right? I subscribe to the very original sort of the DevOps handbook. Gene and companies, and Kim's, and all these people that were early days and sort of made a loosely defined book that you can create, but they weren't like one-liner definitions. And I think that was a real challenge, not necessarily a mistake, because they didn't want to necessarily claim ownership of exactly what it meant. But now every company uses it as a marketing term. These are all marketing terms now. And GitOps started to happen that way. Like we started to see it very early on, like everybody was throwing it around. And what I love about this Open GitOps standard was that you tell me if I'm correct in this, but it looks like multiple companies came together and said, let's make some hard rules so that you know if you're GitOps or not. Like so that you can know whether you've actually implemented it, because just having infrastructure as code is not enough. Just having the ability to apply something or deploy something to Kubernetes is not enough. It's not Kubernetes specific. I love that. So
yeah, I mean, shout out to Alexis Richardson from Weaveworks on this, because he coined the term GitOps, and B, when it came time to, hey, this can be a real kind of set of principles that people can actually follow that means something. That's not just a marketing buzzword, but it's actually like a discipline. It's like an implementation of continuous delivery, continuous deployment. And he was very open to it. And so we launched this group called the GitOps Working Group. And I think the founding group was CodeFresh, Weaveworks, Microsoft. It was kind of Azure and GitHub, because I think they were still separate at the time. And then I think, am I forgetting anybody? Red Hat joined shortly after. They were pretty quick on the ball, but I think they weren't there at the very beginning. But as we kind of created this GitOps Working Group, the goal was, let's define GitOps principles as something that you can kind of measure yourself against. And we wanted to really be careful with the line here, because we didn't want it to be a standard per se that you could like beat people over the head with and be like,
right,
you're not GitOps, version 1 compliant. Because when you look at the principles of what we're trying to do with GitOps, for so many people, they're like, oh, I don't even have stuff to define declaratively, or like, I'm not even doing, I'm not, whatever. So it's like, let's have these be principles that you can kind of adhere to and help you adopt and move along your journey, so that you have kind of like, well, this is like a North Star of where we'd like to get to. We understand that, sometimes in the real world, because of different stakeholders or requirements, you can't quite get there. But ideally, you have a North Star, and you have like something to like, build against. And so
aspire to almost. Yeah.
And it took a year. It took a year, and we had, I think, over 100 contributors, 60 different organizations. I think there were close to 200 different contributors and 60 different organizations that were part of it, for us to launch this as a set of principles. And what's amazing is we worked really hard to make them really short and understandable. But they're like, when you really understand each principle, when you really read it clearly and you understand it, it means a lot. And it has a lot baked into it. So I was really happy with that result. And of course, we do GitOpsCon now, and that's been one of the most popular co-located conferences with KubeCon, and has been very successful, luckily.
Yeah, I was there in Detroit, and broke my rule about pre-conf stuff, and went and paid the money to go to that, and it was great. It was one of my favorites was learning about all the different secret. I think it was like a lightning talk that a couple of the guys did around the different secret storage options for Kubernetes, and I learned about the external secrets operator and why it might be a better choice in a lot of cases. At the time, I was a big
Andrew Block
fan.
Talk, A Million Ways to Do Secrets.
Yeah,
I remember that one. That's a great one. I reference that one all the time.
Yeah, you can look. These are all probably on YouTube too. I think I reference it on YouTube a lot. So if you just look up like GitOpsCon Kubernetes secrets or something, you'll probably find that. Yeah, and I mean, I totally get the challenge of how can we make this page, this huge article of an idea, into a single line about version and immutable, right? That's got it. Like the shorter your statement has to be, the harder it has to be. Any of us that have had to write CFPs where they limit your response to 80 characters for the title or whatever, we've all been in that struggle. One of the things I've noticed even recently, of course, this is the challenge with naming things, is I was just having a conversation, I think it was yesterday, in fact, with a Docker team member, and we were talking about Flux and maybe Argo does this, I'm not actually sure, but the idea to use OCI registries for the actual artifacts in case you didn't necessarily have Git repo access from your clusters. And it was an interesting discussion, which, GitOps has this word Git in it. Some people have said it's unfortunate that it has that word in there. I think that declarative ops, I don't know what we could make some longer term. But I talk to people now, and I'm realizing that maybe even Git isn't necessarily, as long as and the reality is you don't have the word Git in any of those 4 principles. That really, as long as these principles are maintained, it's okay if you're using. I'm a huge fan of OCI registries for storing everything. Everything is an artifact. So I'm on that bandwagon.
This was very intentional. I mean, GitOps as a phrase, I think, does a really good job of describing kind of the principle of what is Git. Git is version immutable, version control, right? And so that's where the namesake comes from. And in the principle, we say that it needs to be desired state needs to be versioned and immutable. And that means you could store it in an OCI registry. You can store it in a Google Sheet. I mean, you can store it in all kinds of ways that you want. And it's not limited to Git. If you wanted to do it with SVN, you can. As long as it's versioned and immutable, it's GitOps. It doesn't even have to be using Git. So I think Git captures the spirit, of what it is, and it's short, which is nice. I think that helps a lot, because if it was versioned and immutable ops, no one would want to, that hashtag sucks.
We'd have to deal with an acronym, and then we'd have to like the CNCF. We have or some other many thousands of acronyms. We'd have to tell people what the acronym is, and then they'd forget.
VCS ops, no, I think GitOps captures it, and almost all of us are using Git anyway. So, but OCI as source of truth is definitely like a great use case. I mean, that's it makes a lot of sense. You can sign it. There's a lot of benefits to using OCI.
Well, we have a couple questions in chat already. I'm going to skip the swarm questions for today. Thank you. By the way, there was one of the questions, and this is kind of related to that. What if you don't have Kubernetes? So this is an interesting thing, because GitOps, at least from my point of view, it felt like it came out of the Kubernetes ecosystem, just because to me, it was like that was where all the focus was on innovation. But this is in no way Kubernetes specific. Do you know have you seen other tools, or have you seen people experimenting with the idea of GitOps in something outside of Kubernetes?
Yeah. So if you go back to like the Chef Puppet days, and I mean, there's still a lot of people using that stuff. They actually had done some of the stuff that's in GitOps, and the guy who created Puppet on Twitter always, he's yelled at me in the past on Twitter, because he says he's like you guys are just repackaging something we were doing in the 90s, and I say yes, absolutely, but it was really hard to do in the 90s.
Yeah.
And now it's really easy to do. So when it comes to Kubernetes, I mean, Kubernetes is ideal because it is such a great way to handle declarative state, and it has really good reconciliation. So it is ideal for GitOps. But as long as you have some mechanism that can consume declarative format and check against it and apply it, and I mean, you can do it with Terraform, and there's some tooling out there. And HashiCorp is actually coming out with a new version of their Terraform controller that is specifically designed to be better at handling kind of GitOps.
Ooh,
so I think that there are options that exist out there, but compared to we're definitely very, very far ahead with Argo CD and Kubernetes. I think we're much farther ahead on GitOps than traditional infrastructure is.
Yeah. It's like that's where we're figuring out what we like and what we need and what we don't need. Like the fact that OCI registries can now be the endpoint, S3 can possibly be an endpoint for sort of the version and immutable aspects of it. And having a conversation this week around air-gapped environments, and if they don't have access to the code repos, because typically in an air-gapped environment you don't have Git. It might not be a thing that you necessarily have access to directly. And I feel like we're into the edge cases. We're into a little bit to the fringe. I know with Argo, my favorite application set features now in the last couple of years have been bundled in. So that's a relatively new thing of like, oh yeah, we're all probably going to not want to manually create a YAML for every app manually by hand. And there's just, I feel like there's a lot of, let's make this as easy as possible while also at the same time having the 4 principles still followed. I just wanted to mention to that someone else asked is Swarm, how do you do this outside of Kubernetes? There is technically a tool for Swarm. They call it Swarm Sync. It's GitOps for Swarm. It's not maintained. The last update was 4 years ago, which is a little unfortunate, which is why I don't recommend it anymore. But it was a small project.
They already got it right 4 years ago.
Yeah, well, and Swarm doesn't change, so it hasn't. We've only had a few feature updates since 2019, so it's not like it needs to maintain for breakage points. But if you didn't realize, I seem to foster a small little Swarm community, small but passionate.
Yeah, I noticed in the chat people were like, "Swarm for life. Swarm never dies. We are Swarm."
It's always fun to have someone on who has maybe like a history of like leaving Swarm or publicly denouncing Kubernetes the winner as if there was a fight, because I always have to warn them and say, just so you know, this is the unofficial Swarm hangout, so you're going to get people that are going to, if we have a tool on, someone's going to ask, hey, does that tool work on Swarm? And, of course, sadly, most of the time the answer is no.
Yeah.
But, I love my Swarm people. So, people that just want, really, it's at the end of the day, it's not even probably that it's Swarm specifically. It's that there's an aversion to the unnecessary complexity of some of the other products out there. So I get you. That's why I love Argo and love GitOps, is I feel like we're getting closer to a prescriptive CI/CD environment, where, but 5 years, I remember probably at the same conference you and I met at, those 2017, 2018 days were days of, okay, well, we've this container thing is definitely here to stay. Seems like Kubernetes and these other operators all are coalescing on the same idea, the Raft consensus, all of these algorithms around distributed state awareness. What's the next real big problem? And we were all tending to agree that the CI/CD aspect, the automation in the middle, is this nebulous, you walked into the world of Jenkins or Drone back in the day or whatever. Travis, and it was open, right? Like it was a blank slate. It was like you were the artist. This was your canvas, and good luck. Figure it out. Like you have code commits, and then you have a server over there, and you figure out what goes in the middle. And I feel like, at least for the CD part of this, I feel like the GitOps standards or principles are getting us all to start agreeing, so that you and I can be at the different companies, and when we hang out, we don't have entirely different workflows. And if I hire you, you don't have to completely relearn how deployments work for my solution, because it's
it's nice if there's a best practice.
Yeah, it feels like we're getting closer to that. It is still relatively new, but
I think it's a David Fincher quote where he's talking about filmmaking, and he says something like, there are infinite number of ways you could shoot a scene, but at the end of the day, there's really two, and one of them is wrong. And I feel like that's software delivery, because when it comes to CI pipelines, and this kind of drives me nuts, right? Like if you go back and you think about the first CI pipelines, I was talking to Kat Cosgrove yesterday on the GitOps the Planet stream.
Hi, Kat.
The first CI came out in 1992.
Yeah.
And what did it do? It checked out a code repo, it built that code, it ran tests, and it shipped an artifact. That's what it does. That's what CI pipelines do. And you can be, bespoke about what kind of tests you run and how you handle caching and all these things. But at the end of the day, that's all it does. And it kind of drives me crazy that we reinvent pipelines over and over and over again for every single service. And this kind of goes back to one of the reasons that we started CodeFresh in the first place, is because when it came to containers and it came to microservices, you had the problem of, I now have an explosion of services because I'm using microservices. And the old way of doing it was each service gets its own pipeline. So now I have 1,000 services. That means I have to have 1,000 pipelines. Why am I rebuilding the same pipeline over again? What are we doing here? What is this Mickey Mouse approach to software delivery? Like,
why am I copy and pasting?
Do not repeat yourself, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of when we launched CodeFresh. It was on the focus of shared pipelines and the idea of I can create a single pipeline and it can have 1,000 triggers for each different microservice that carries with it the context of what it needs to build and test, and I'll do all that stuff. And I haven't looked back since. It's been very nice to have one pipeline that can handle 1,000 different microservices, and it's all baked in and cached, and it's easy to work with.
Yeah, the reusability aspect of a lot of these modern solutions, I feel like, are, it makes me cringe whenever I see someone still struggling, and I hate to pick on Jenkins, but it's easy to pick on. It's kind of like Comcast. That it was just the very idea that we're going to define the workflows and the pipelines that you're using inside the code, and that's the only acceptable way to store, whether it's beside the code in a different repo or in the same repo, regardless. The idea that back in the day, I mean, I was doing a lot of clicking and copying, pasting stuff into pipelines in Jenkins, and they were stored in Jenkins, right? Like I wasn't necessarily connecting it to Git repos back in the day. Git wasn't near as popular. I might have been using a Team Foundation Server or something. It kind of shows my age as the Windows guy. But we had and it was very opinionated to the person who implemented it. And so that's one thing that really irked me is you could go to 5 different companies and you would have 5 completely different processes. And there was usually only one person that could handle it because it was so complex. They usually also were a little bit of a server admin because you had to maintain the Jenkins servers. And so the developers were sort of disconnected from how their code was tested, built, and deployed. They were just, when it didn't work, they had to call a person. And that really, I think that my first sort of exciting jump into I would say modern automation. I don't even like to call them CI/CD platforms anymore because it's just automation platforms, and they can do all kinds of things. I mean, when you're doing SBOMs and all this stuff, is that really CI? So I realized that when I started to engage with a new product or a new tool that was putting it in YAML or a similar format, and the developers could understand it, and that they could also affect change without being prompted or having to be trained by some CI/CD solution expert. And they were just like, no, I want I want to build it this way, and I want these additional tests, and we probably should be changing it a little bit so that the assets we're deploying are immutable or whatever, right? And you were engaging the developers almost to the point where I wouldn't say that they had complete responsibility for it, but I felt like it started to become a shared responsibility between dev and ops. And that, to me, was like, okay, I don't want to even look at the old way we were all doing it because, that one person leaves the company or they're on vacation and we can't fix CI because, the 45-minute long test run failed at 30 minutes from some random reason. There's no one that can work on it except for that Jenkins person.
Flaky CI tests are a bane on software delivery. I have a kind of macabre way of looking at this. I've been told it's off-putting, so I'll share it with you anyway. But I call this the bus number, which is like how many people can get hit by a bus before no one knows how to do anything. And if when it comes to like these bespoke CI tests, flaky, whatever, it's like usually there's like the bus number is 1. There's like one person that knows how to do it. And that's a real problem. I mean, that's not because people should be expendable, but because as an organization, things should be clear enough that people can operate without always engaging a specific person. And it's actually a sign of kind of bad organization where you'll be like, oh, don't worry, we've got this superstar. They're so good, everything hinges on them. And it's like, well, that's just vanity. Like that's an organization built by vanity for this one person. Like if their stuff was that good, it should be simple enough that anybody can use it. Right? That's like that Feynman. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. And that's what your organization should be. It should be simple enough that anybody within the organization can operate it. It shouldn't be bespoke.
Yeah, if we were to go down the rabbit hole of like jobs and like what it is to be senior, to me, it's like mentorship is almost number one of, I don't care how good you are at what you can do. I want to know how many other people that are around you that you can also have trained to do that, right? Cross training and mentorship. And I feel like, especially nowadays when none of us can know it all and there's just too much stuff for any one person in a team to be the expert on all of it. I feel like that's so
Yeah.
important. But we have some great questions. So you and I, again, we're going to go down rabbit holes, but you people in the chat, I respect you, and I'm going to ask you your questions because you got some good ones. The first one was, I saw up here, was really around Argo CD portability. So AWS, Dan asks, is there a way to migrate Argo CD from AWS GovCloud to our own company's AWS? So it's almost like I guess the question is, how portable is Argo CD in terms of one cluster to another?
Yeah, so portable. And so we do have a project that is pretty useful. And when it comes to this opinionated stuff, we were talking about like, hey, I want to know the right way to do stuff. I don't want it to be different every time. So there is this project that we built called Argo CD Autopilot. And basically what it is an opinionated way of setting up and running Argo CD. Now, you don't have to use this. This is literally just Argo CD with some defaults. So
Right.
you can create this yourself. But the nice thing is that we actually do provide a CLI. And if I want to, I've got my repo, I've got everything defined, everything's in Git. If I go to a new cluster or my cluster is nuked, I can run Argo CD Autopilot, bootstrap, -- recover, and it will install Argo CD, set up the config, have it pull from the source of truth in GitHub, and then it will just sync everything else that it needs to sync. So there's no issue about getting it back up and running. There's no additional setup. And one of the things that you mentioned about Argo CD being really popular is the wonderful UI. There's kind of like an adoption arc when it comes to Argo CD, which is when you first start using it, you're probably just using the UI and you're adding an application and you're rocking and rolling and it's great. But most of that stuff isn't actually stored in Git, right? So when you create an application, you create an application YAML. It's a custom resource. There's a CRD for it in Kubernetes. And when you create that app, it just pushes it onto the cluster and it starts syncing, according to what you've set. That app doesn't exist inside of Git. So Argo CD Autopilot does provide a way of generating applications, and they're stored in Git. And then, of course, if you're using CodeFresh, which is like the enterprise version of Argo, the UI actually writes everything to Git. So you don't get stuck in a situation where stuff is only existing in the UI. And most teams that I know who use Argo CD, they say, hey, we love this because it helped us learn how to use the tool, but we actually just disable all the UI stuff so that people aren't writing stuff just to state in the cluster. It actually does need to go into Git. So that's a pretty important aspect to it.
Yeah. Autopilot, something that I've played with. In fact, is kind of what inspired me around like some of the concepts that you basically auto write. You write all this YAML automatically, you spit it out, like you were saying. And I used it as a learning tool because it helped me understand the apps of apps pattern a little bit more, and also how I could possibly have an application resource kind actually point me to application set resource kinds, which then generate more applications. Now I'm like down the nesting dolls of three levels deep. So that was actually a really good tool. Even if I find that even if it's something that you can't use for whatever reasons, or if the workflow of it, but I love the opinionated aspects, because sometimes, and the things that I mentioned in my course is, Argo. Funny thing is Argo CD is not called Argo GitOps, right? So like, it is a little bit like Kubernetes, where it is unopinionated. You can use the Argo CD command line. You can use complete YAML and completely ignore the command line. You can, there are ways you can do it imperatively. You can do it in the UI, right? You can make changes in the UI just like you can make changes in AWS if you allow it like that. So there are definitely sort of a lot of unopinionated or non-GitOps things that you can do with it. And so I think having these kind of tools or the guidance around, look, if you believe in the GitOps idea and you really want to try to stick to those principles, how can you make sure that you stay on the rails with Argo CD? And I liked the a little bit of the YAML output. I liked that opinionated, hey, we're going to make these standard folder structures, and we're going to make it nice and easy for things to reference each other. And yeah, it's a pretty cool tool. I even for those that are looking to get into GitOps, trying to understand Argo, definitely recommend the autopilot tool, because it kind of almost can help you enforce some standards around the YAML that is easy to get. If you're just walking through the Argo CD setup welcome page and you're typing all these commands and doing this stuff at the command line, it can make you think that, like, oh yeah, I can definitely go in and change that. I can sync and unsync manually from the UI and the web interface, and there's a lot of things that might end up being non-GitOpsy bad behaviors eventually.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, nice.
Argo CD, for example, doesn't say anything about repository structure, because as a tool, Argo CD is ultimately unopinionated. And that's great, because people can do what they want, and you can adapt it to whatever you're already doing. But if you're getting started with a new repo, everyone asks us, hey, how should I set up this structure? Should I have a folder for apps? Should I have branches for each environment, or should I use folders? Don't use branches, by the way. It's a terrible idea. But like, all of that kind of stuff, it's like, it's just baked in so that you just get the kind of opinionated experience, and you don't have to follow it. You can break it. You can go in and tweak it. It's all sitting in your repo. You own it, so you can do whatever you want with it. So it is really nice in that way. So yeah, it's something I'm a big fan of. This person's asking why they would want to use GitOps over something like GitHub Actions CI/CD. Is that an okay question if we take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually something that I'm passionate about, because it is not always immediately obvious what you read the definition of GitOps and you're like, okay, but why? Yeah. So please give us your scoop.
Yeah, if you've got let's say for example, you have a cron job, and all this cron job does is check out the latest changes from a repo and apply those changes to a cluster. You're done, right? I mean, why isn't that what GitOps is? And a CI pipeline similar, right? So even a CI/CD pipeline, and let's say you're using GitHub Actions or anything else, there are occasionally issues that happen where a trigger may not issue properly. There'll be an outage, a disruption, whatever it is, and you miss the trigger, and so the pipeline doesn't even run in the first place. This has happened, it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen, and you can be in a situation where you're trying to apply changes and they're actually out of sync. You're actually applying changes to a state that you don't expect, and that can cause issues, and certainly people have had outages because their CI/CD pipeline just didn't run for whatever reason. So right off the bat, in GitOps, you can use, but you can't rely exclusively on triggers to make your deployments happen. You actually need to have an active check for reconciliation. And that eliminates that section of problems of pipeline didn't run for some reason. There was some issue, there was some flakiness in a test or whatever, and it didn't happen. So now we actually have a declarative state that's being applied. So that's kind of one. But the other side of it is on the reconciliation side. So let's say that there is a change that has been made in production and it wasn't checked into Git. And people will say, oh, we never do that. People will say, oh, we never do that. You do it. And I'll show you where you do it. You probably have a pod autoscaler turned on that's going to change the number of replicas on the pod. As one does. That's great. That's awesome. You should do that. Well, should I have to check that change into Git? And this is maybe a little bit more controversial, because this essentially represents a meta state. So with something like Argo CD, this is a really great feature that is called ignore differences, where you can say, as a policy, I don't want Argo CD to worry about reconciling number of pods, because I've actually delegated that to some other controller. So don't worry about if that state changes. So you can kind of set these rules about which kinds of changes would trigger auto healing and overwriting from Git, and what kind of changes actually need to be left out. And there are a lot of use cases, not just autoscalers, but also security policy and things like that, where maybe it's writing some additional values. You have these other controllers. You really can't use active controllers in Kubernetes and do GitOps without using something like Argo CD, where you can ignore differences and set up policy to delegate those things to other things. So that's another advantage is kind of the active monitoring that Pelin is pointing out, that you have this active monitor. Another one is just knowing the state. So if you think about CI/CD as your source of truth, where you have a pipeline that runs and issues a deployment, you're going to say, and if I said, hey, what's currently deployed? How will you figure that out? And I've heard people say, well, I go and look and see what pipeline is the last one that ran, and that's what's running.
Right.
Maybe it is. You don't know that. You're inferring that. And maybe your organization has really good discipline and practices and security, but you don't actually know that that's what's running. So you don't actually have ground truth about what's happening with your service. And so people will say, well, I go into Prometheus, I dig in the logs and I find the version number and then I know. And it's like, okay, well, that sucks. That's a terrible way to do it. So,
right. Right.
So
not everybody has access to that. Yeah. And how do people know? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that having that ground truth helps a ton, just from a GitOps perspective.
Yeah, I've heard some people say that they feel like when it comes to this, the difference between GitOps and maybe those that already do primarily infrastructure as code, they already have their pipelines automated, it's all defined in YAML and Git, and that it ends up being number 4 that is the difference, that you're probably not doing this continual reconciliation. And I think sometimes maybe with Kubernetes, because at least at the pod level, it can, it'll restart containers that have failed. It has a rollback mechanism that you can enable. It feels like we almost thought for a while that maybe we don't have to, like maybe it takes care of that. Like maybe we can just not have to care. But the reality is, like you're saying, like unless someone's looking at a Kubernetes dashboard that has kubectl apply or kubectl git abilities, even just read only, like unless they're at that level, it's hard to know the state of your cluster. And I think that's a real claim to fame, for me at least, of Argo CD, is that the web dashboard is not cluster admin focused. Like every other GUI for Kubernetes is, to me, maybe there's one or two that are troubleshooting focused, but most of them are all like cluster admin. They care about nodes and all the different resource types, where I love that Argo CD focuses on the application that you're deploying, which may have lots of different resources, and you need to understand the relationships of these resources and which ones are failing or which ones are currently rolling out, or is the cluster actually in sync with what you've defined in Git, and show me nice green buttons that give me this clear understanding of, yes, the cluster is in sync. What I see in Git is what's in the cluster. And that's like its home bread and butter. It's just so, I don't know about you, but when I'm consulting and I'm approaching teams with this stuff, my goal is always to give all the developers, usually through SSO mechanisms, like read-only access to the Argo interface, so that they, when their workflows run in their CI solution, they have a place to go to look and see what really happened, right? Because we all have that, okay, well, my tests are running right now. Eventually, it's going to update the Kubernetes or the Helm chart or whatever. It's going to do something. And then the developer's always like, okay, is it in production yet? Is it in production yet? They've got some personal workflow where they're like refreshing a page, or they've got a while loop, or they've done a Linux command on a watch to run the Git to see if the pods change. Like everyone's got their own little thing, because they realize that whatever the CI tool is, even the kubectl apply that tool might be running, that's declarative on itself, right? So it is applied to the API, but that doesn't mean your app is replaced, or that it even worked, right? Yeah, like you're saying. I'm just repeating what you're already saying, but I do love that the Argo CD interface is built in. You can enable it by default. It has all these wonderful enterprisey features like SSO that you're probably showing it on screen there, yeah. And that to me is not necessarily a reason to do GitOps, but it is indicative of how GitOps is, in one way, it is very ops oriented and it's helping the ops team. But in another way, this particular product really helps developers understand what's going on in cluster from their application owner point of view, which is way different to me than the cluster admin point of view.
Well, I'm showing an example here. This is actually my home lab cluster. And so this is, if you can see behind me, there's like 3 nodes kind of just over my shoulder. So those are 3 of the, I've got more nodes off the screen, but 3 nodes for my Kubernetes cluster. And I'm actually doing some work on my Plex implementation right now. So I've got hardware acceleration going, but I needed to fix up kind of job distribution working properly. And so I've actually taken this one into manual sync, and I'm actually editing the cluster live. Now that's fine because it's a home lab cluster. I wouldn't do this against a production, cluster. I would have like a staging or a dev cluster that I might do this on, or even just a local cluster. But I have full clarity of what's going on and what's out of sync and what's happening. Even though it's out of sync, I can still go in and look at the logs and see the events. And in this case, I don't have any events, but like I'm looking at those events all the time when I'm tweaking stuff, because it's like, oh, this PVC didn't mount properly, or like, there's not an available node for what I'm doing or whatever. So this kind of drill down from a developer standpoint, so useful. And I mean, just even having a logical grouping of applications lets me look at like, the specific app that I'm working on, which isn't like, Kubernetes doesn't have the concept of an app, right? Like it's just like, we got namespaces, we got resources, do what you're going to do. So being able to look at, my section, even though it might be overlapping with some, existing namespace or something, but I'm still scoping where I want to be. That's really helpful.
Right. You and I could definitely do. I mean, there's videos all over the internet. For those that are interested in Argo, there's a lot of conference talks, entire conferences that have workshops and videos on YouTube about getting started with Argo. And so there's definitely a lot of resources out there for that. The documentation is also really great. So I'm sure CodeFresh has a bunch of good documentation. You also have a GitOps certification. I'm assuming that's Argo focused, or GitOps plus Argo.
Yeah. So the GitOps certification, I thought I would just have a link here. Oh yeah, GitOps certified. So this certification, and if I go to it, it's just going to show me the dashboard, I think, because I'm logged in. So this GitOps certification basically gives you, so you can go off screen. Sorry. But we have a certification at learning.codefresh.io. We basically just charge the cost of infrastructure to run it, because you do get labs and stuff. But it will show you how to create your, thank you. Yeah, thank you. It'll show you how to create your repositories, how to structure them, how to do your first canary deployment, how to set up your applications, how to do application sets. And that's most of that stuff is actually even in the level 1. The level 2, which focuses on scale, goes a lot deeper into this stuff. And so it's been very popular. I think this isn't public yet, so you'll hear it here first. But I think we'll probably have a press release about this. But we have about 20,000 students now. So it is the fastest growing, most popular GitOps certification in the world, and very highly recommended. So definitely check it out. And we have a Discord community that goes with it. So if you're doing, I think it's very supplemental to the live training that you're doing, Bret, with Argo CD, and I think they go together well. So would definitely recommend that.
Yeah, that's the challenge with live training, is I can't make you sit through 20 hours of slides in Zoom, right? So yeah, the live training is very much about patterns and practices and implementing, I think, probably what someone could really learn through this certification, the features and the sort of the optimized workflows, and there's a lot of things that, like we were talking earlier, there's a lot of things with Argo that you can go down rabbit holes of amazing features, but you might implement them in a way that's actually you might regret, or it might have side effects. And so one of the things that I've been able to do with the live training, and again, this is the first time I've ever done this kind of style of workshop online, where we actually interview you before. We get your information before you're in the course, so that the course is specific to the problems the people that are in the class have. And that's something that none of my video, after 23 hours of Docker mastery, I still don't have stuff in there in that course that's probably very specifically applicable to your Java app inside of GovCloud, that. When people want that kind of implementation, they have to go for consulting, and consultants are expensive. So that was the whole idea, was like, how do we productize consulting, but also make it applicable to more than one team at the same time? And so that's kind of.
Oh, did you just go on mute, or is it just me that?
Oh, I
Oh,
switched
there we go.
screens,
We got you back now. Okay.
and now, yeah, when I switched screen, I had myself on mute. That's me. I always go on mute or mistake the mute button every show because I live near a jet base, and it's
Oh,
a little bit of advice. If you're going to make a live stream out of your house every week, maybe don't live near
gotta
the
live
East
under
Coast
jet.
Navy base. Yeah. So I love that it's GitOps mastery, by the way. Ode to the mastery word. That was something I love to put in the courses because it's hard to come up with good naming nowadays. I should have snagged that domain.
Do you want to scroll down and just show the course levels? I think
Oh
it's
yeah,
good
yeah.
to see. And then we've got this. Yeah, one down, one down.
Oh, here we
There you
go.
go.
Oh yeah. So this
we
is the
have-
3 different
we have a
levels.
third one that we're working on. But yeah, can we actually answer this question from Dan? I think this is actually a really
Yep.
important point about GitOps. And this isn't necessarily a principle thing. This is more about an implementation thing. And from a GitOps principle standpoint, either of these are going to be functional. But Dan is asking, you don't recommend using Gitflow. We should be using GitHub Flow or trunk-based development, something like that. So I'll share my screen. I'll show you that this is here's what I recommend. So here I've got an application. This application is called Trio app. And in this application, I'm doing trunk-based development. So I've got I've create feature branches. I work on them, they tested, and then they're synced in, and we run builds and that kind of stuff. So this is trunk-based development. Now for my GitOps repo, so I've got one here called DevOps. I do not recommend doing trunk-based development. So I do not have a separate a separate branch for staging, a separate branch for dev. What we do is we do take pull requests and stuff, but when I look at an application, so for example, I've got this Trio app, you can see I have a folder for each environment that represents the different values. You know, if it's a Helm chart or if it's an overlay, if it's customization, that represent those things. So all of these environments are modeled between folders, and I can run a git diff between two folders. You know, no problem. And this saves a lot of headache with adopting GitOps that people get when they try to do trunk-based or branch-based environments. And the problem is that it's hard to do diffing. It's hard to copy changes between them. It's very easy to do between folders. And you also have, if you need to do disaster recovery, I can just rebootstrap this whole repo and all of my environments come back. So I don't have to actually care about that. Whereas if you're doing trunk-based, of course, you have to go and like bootstrap each individual, section. So it's trickier. So this is definitely something we recommend from a structure standpoint, is to follow this folder-based environments. And you can see I've got my applications and then under here I have each environment and which applications are going to be deployed to those environments. So these are all represented in YAMLs, right? So these are my application custom resources, and I've got my self-healing turned on this one, and you can see all that stuff. And then I have a separate folder for my manifests where I model out the actual environments for all these. And if it's not a Helm chart, maybe it's just a customization, or maybe it's literally just YAML, whatever it is. It's represented in the different environment folders, and I have what I need to work, and do my comparisons and stuff. And I actually really like customize, but you can do it with Helm or customize. Either one's fine.
Yeah. I'm also a customized fan. My general guidance has been for a while now that for internal software, this is like a very common question in the courses is, customize Helm versus Helm, like whatever. And I don't know about you, but I tell people, like, you're gonna have to use both. Like, you're gonna have to learn both. I'm sorry, you're probably not gonna be able to get through your Kubernetes career with containers or if you're gonna do Kubernetes. These are the two tools to use.
Yeah,
Helm is great for consuming third-party projects out there, open source projects. Postgres clusters, complicated tools. But if you're making software internally for your team to deploy, try customize first. Try to use the folder structure that Dan's showing. I find that it scales extremely well, especially with Argo CD and application sets. You can actually free the developers from any additional YAML creation, which they love. The biggest complaint I get about GitOps is too much YAML, too many PRs. I don't want to have 3 PRs to deploy my application. All I want to do is feature branch and then maybe one more thing, maybe one thing.
Yeah.
And you can do that with Argo in a safe, reliable, human gated production deployment way. It's actually, that's the way that I teach it in the courses is like that. Is usually I can convince the developer teams, hey, I know that you have to write some of this Kubernetes YAML. I get it. It sucks. But once we get the template down, when you're doing your feature branches in your apps, ideally there's only one other PR you have to approve, and then production is done. Like I won't make you edit YAML every time you want to deploy. Like that's it feels a little too much when you're doing 20 deployments a day to edit YAML
have
20
automation
times.
take that. I mean, it's tedious, and best case scenario, you're just gonna accidentally fat finger a change one day and you'll have to undo it. Whereas if you just do automation, it's just going to be done perfectly every time. So it's a lot easier.
Yeah, and I'm assuming CodeFresh has got some magic going on there to bridges that. That's always the challenge I feel like is like we build test, we push images, right? Once everything's approved, everything is pushed. We maybe do image promotion, all that enterprisey stuff, and then there's this YAML needs to be changed.
Yeah,
and that's the big. I don't know what CodeFresh does for you, but there's usually a step there.
The magic? I can show you here. So
yeah, we got time.
Here I'm looking at Argo, and so this I was showing you earlier. This is my home lab instance of just a community version of Argo. Within CodeFresh, you have an enterprise version, and this looks very familiar, right? I've got my squares with my different applications, but there are a couple of differences you're going to notice right off the bat. First of all, you can see that I actually have multiple runtimes represented here, and a runtime is an Argo instance. So these are actually multiple Argo instances that I'm looking at, but I'm looking at them in a single UI. So I can have 1,000 different Argo instances installed in different locations for different reasons, and there's a lot of reasons that we could talk about why you architect Argo to have multiple instances. But here I get a whole roll up of all of my instances, and then you can also see we're calling out the difference between an application and what we call a Git source app. This is a parent app. If you're using app of apps, then this is a parent app. This is just saying this application only contains other applications. And then you can see we also represent application sets. So you can see which application sets are running and what they're doing. So that's all pretty helpful right off the bat. The other thing I mentioned is if I go to add an application, so if I were to create an application and I specify which runtime it's going to go on to, when I get to this screen to actually configure my application, and I could go and set up, whatever application to be deployed. When I go to save this, it's actually a commit, because what we're doing here is it actually knows the source of truth for this runtime, this cluster. And so when I commit it, it'll actually just go directly and be saved to the proper folder in Git. So my UI is actually helping me be, compliant and keep stuff organized. So this is the only way I do it. And this is kind of behind the scenes. This is sort of an interesting way that this works, because these keys and the ability to commit is actually from the user's browser. It's not from CodeFresh itself. And so CodeFresh doesn't actually have to have access to the Git repo in order for me to use this commit. So I would need to be VPN'd into, if I have like a Bitbucket, that's behind the firewall in my corporate VPN or whatever, I would do that. So that's kind of a nice little feature. But all the same usability stuff that I have in the community version, obviously I have here. So if I go and look at let's look at this one. So if I go and look at this one, you can see I've got the current state. All of this looks pretty similar, right? I can go and look in the pod and I can check out the logs. And if there were any events, I could see those. And I can specify if there's multiple containers as part of it. In a pod, I can go to that. Same stuff you'd expect. But we introduced the concept of a release timeline. So the release timeline shows me every deployment that has happened over time. So you can see I've deployed like 6 times today. And on each of these, I'm actually going to pull out way more metadata. So what we do is, like if we look at this guy, we can see that there was one service that was updated, and this is the container that was changed. Because 99% of the time that you're making changes, it's just updating a container with the new version of code, right? You're not actually modifying the manifest very much. So if I was just using the community version, I would click on my commit, and it would just show me, hey, this image changed. So what CodeFresh does is we actually look at that image, And then we bring all the associated information to say, oh, for this image, this is the Jira ticket that was being worked on. This is the pull request that was being merged. So I can actually jump over to this pull request and see what code changes were made to actually build this application. This is the CI pipeline that ran it. Here are the people that committed to it. Here are all the commits that they made. So you just have instant clarity about what's going on and all of the context for every change. So to go back to, I think, what spawned this whole train of thought here, which was, how do we update applications so that they're ready to go? Like I've made a change. So the way that this one works, and I'll show you an example here. If I look at this PR, and I go back and, if I look at this PR and I look at when this was merged, so this was merged over here, and I go ahead and just pull up that commit, and I could look at this 15 different ways, but if I look at my pipeline here, I have this build and deploy pipeline that's running versus this build pipeline. And what this pipeline is doing is at the end of its process of building and testing and signing and all that stuff, it actually triggers a pipeline whose whole job it is just to make the PR. And now in this case, I'm actually just I'm having it automatically, because this one's going to staging. This is one pipeline. This is a shared pipeline, right? So I've created this once, but I'm using it for every service. And this is actually just making a commit to my repo, my DevOps repo, which is then being reflected by Argo CD autopilot, by Argo CD. So the magic is just having an automated commit in this case. That's why I've set this one up. But you might also do something else, like if I were to go look at another pipeline, let's see, I want to show you, this is a build one. I want to show you, oh yeah, this one. I'll show you this one. So another example, another way to do this would be, see, this one actually has an approval on it. So this one is doing kind of a similar model where it's actually updating the manifest and committing, except this one is pending approval on production. So there's a manual approval step that's here, and then it will actually make the commit and then trigger a sync manually. And the reason you would trigger the sync manually is because some organizations just aren't ready for having full auto sync to be turned on. They want to have that. No, I want to look at it. I want to see it. I want to, know. So this one's actually manual sync, but with an approval step. And so in this case, this approval is set to automatically approve just because it's a demo one. But that's a good example. So yeah, the magic is basically just making a commit. I mean, it just doesn't sound that magical when I just say it like that, but that makes it really, really easy.
Yeah, I think, you and I we were talking before the show, there's lots of CIs out there, and I sadly don't know CodeFresh as much as I know GitHub Actions, but that I always feel like I don't have a really good name for this thing in a generic term of the industry. I've been calling it in my course and the auto GitOps PR approach or whatever, and you can have that commit or that pull request automatically committed, and then magic happens with Argo and it picks up the change in Git. Or you can choose to have it gated. I call it human gated, where you need someone who's, what is it? The monkey needs to click the button to deploy to production. It's like I need to have a human. We don't yet fully trust everything in our automation. So there needs to be one final thing in production for that developer, and the developers can have access. You can control it, and maybe only ops or DevOps has access to it. Right? I think any of these solutions, like you said, any fresh CodeFresh. I almost called it Fresh Ops. Maybe is that a name? Fresh Ops.
It sounds similar, right?
Yeah. Whether it's CodeFresh or some other CI, whether or not the people listening are able to use CodeFresh, you can implement this in a PR style. And the trick is you're going to have to do that cross repo PR or commit to, whether it's going to be a commit, whether it's in a feature branch or not. But that's, I think, to me, one of the big aspects of getting devs on board with GitOps, because I have implemented this. Everything's in Git, including the deployment specifications. And the one burden I think a lot of people have is, well, this is great. This is all infrastructure as code now. I can see it all everywhere. But I had a team where they went from one PR for every application feature, right, that merged, they went from 1 PR to 3 because they had set up this approach where then they needed to go change the image in the Helm chart or the customized YAML manually, which, like you're saying, we talked about earlier, that's to go find out what the name of that new image tag is, or especially if you're trying to do secure supply chain and you have to get the SHA hash. You've got to get that digest. That's a long thing. It's hard to find it. You got to make sure it's the right one that's in the registry. Anyway, you have to figure out that process. And then they were also editing the application spec for Argo, and they were specifying it in there, even though they didn't need to. They were hard coding it in there. So they had this very arduous, full of YAML edits, potential for human error, and they thought that was and they thought that was GitOps. And it is. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just they thought that was, in order to be GitOps, that they had to have all these PRs that humans had to make. And our first goal was, they were using a bunch of different things. They were using Drone and Jenkins and a whole bunch of different stuff all at once. And our goal was, let's automate this with some simple automations that aren't too scary, so that the only thing the dev has to do after they commit their feature branch into their app repo is one other human gate that is a button on a PR or something. And then eventually for staging, they made it automated. We use the image. I think for them, we use the image updater, which we sadly don't have time to talk about, but they use the image updater approach for staging and the sales and dev clusters. And then for production, it was still the final button push for, they didn't want to push the button on a Friday afternoon. So if someone was committing app code on Friday, they were going to hold that button until Monday or whatever. That was kind of their approach, which is totally fine and totally GitOps.
Get your automation out of your way. It's supposed to be enabling you.
Yeah, especially if you got tools like, code. If you're on all these tools like CodeFresh, if you've got Argo CD already, you've had all these modern tools. You need to make it easier. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, I feel like, and that's kind of sometimes the message we tend to simplify this all down to is you need to have a bunch of Git PRs manually by humans, or you have to go full speed. You're automating everything, and the minute you merge a feature branch in the app, you just you stand there and wait and hope that production doesn't. Yeah, if you're doing that, then you need to
we don't have to go all the way in. Yeah, well, and that's our approach too, even from a company perspective. So I showed you pipelines from CodeFresh, but all those features from the GitOps perspective, from GitOps dashboard, those work with Circle CI or GitHub Actions or Jenkins, because we have people who come to us and they're like, hey, I've got 10,000 pipelines. I don't want to rebuild them all just so I can get this extra visibility in my GitOps tool. And it's you shouldn't have to. That's fine. We're just going to integrate it. We're not going to compete on that.
That is true. It's rare in large enterprises that I walk into that they only have one CI platform, and Argo CD, and Argo CD can point at all of them. And it has what I love about the project is it's popular enough now that there is, if you're using a reasonably modern, if you're using Azure DevOps, if you're whatever you're using, there's probably, if you're using Bitbucket, there's probably an integration in Argo or a way for Argo to use that. It's pretty robust.
Yeah, Argo CD by itself doesn't actually have awareness of CI in any way, because it's just looking at the source of truth in Git. So as long as your CI is updating that Git repo, then Argo CD will pick it up. From the CodeFresh perspective, the integrations with CI are around visibility into those commits. So extracting the information from which artifact was updated, what were the pipelines that built that, what were the commits that were made. So it's more about bringing application level changes into the infrastructure layer so you can actually see what's going on, because that's more useful from a developer, DevOps, operations person's perspective than just knowing that an image tag changed.
Yeah, I like it. I love we're all trying to achieve that utopia of one dashboard, right? For the entire life cycle of my software. We're always trying to strive for that. Okay, rapid fire questions, because I know we're running long. Let's see if we can answer these. I'm the worst at answering things quickly, so I'll let you answer them. I think we answered Brock's question on really interested in what it is to put a config repo and also how to manage the source repo to trigger the config repo. So I think we just answered that, Brock. If we didn't, throw in another quick question. Mayesh asked, what are the best practices of Argo CD rollout? Ooh, we didn't talk about rollout.
Yeah,
Any suggestions? Yeah. Any suggestions for Argo CD cluster for prod environments and best practices? I feel like we covered a lot there. If you have
Yeah, I
any,
mean, I think for Argo rollouts, like just start using it, because even if you don't have really great templates for your analysis template, which is how you actually do your health check, you can just start doing a canary and it will just catch basic failures right off the bat. So just start doing it, and you can always fine tune and build out your analysis template later. And Argo rollouts, we just announced a plugin for it that adds cluster API support, which extends the number of load balancers we provide support for from like 8 to like 24, something like that. So no matter what load balancer you're using, there's going to be an option with Argo rollouts to use it via the Gateway API plugin.
nice. Yeah. Gateway API. Yeah. I mean, for the elevator pitch, I feel like for Argo is rollout specifically is that you don't have to use it. It's an optional thing. Do the other things first. I feel like they have a bigger impact. And then once you've got all that refined, if you find that the default Kubernetes style of deployment rolling updates, if that doesn't meet all your needs and you need blue, green, or canary, go check out rollouts. It's definitely cool stuff.
Interestingly, Salesforce adopted Argo rollouts first. So they started doing canary on like 10,000 services before they did anything else. They didn't even
really?
do GitOps. They didn't have the syncing happening. All that stuff was like, that was day 2 problems. They did Argo rollouts first.
That's true. I guess that the reality of rollouts is if you don't have the problem, and you will know when you have the problem that requires things like blue, green, and canary styles.
And to be clear, I agree with you. They probably would have gotten more bang from their buck if they had adopted Argo CD first. But Argo rollouts is really easy to adopt. It doesn't require any change in your software development CI/CD process to start using it. So that's nice.
Yeah, and it is one of those things where kind of like when you realize you need ingress, there's usually like a day in your Kubernetes journey early on where you're like, okay, we can't solve this problem any other way. We need an ingress provider, right? So that's what I feel like with the rollouts. It's like, okay, the application at scale that we're using, we definitely need a canary style deployment, and it doesn't do that. We need a provider. All right, next question. Any ideas on combining Dagger with Argo? Ooh, this is an edge case. I don't know if you've played with Dagger. This is for those that don't know. Yeah, this is Solomon Hykes, an inventor of Docker, the founder of Docker. Originally, this is his next big project. It's like a CI in your CIs. It's kind of how I describe it, or a CI by code that you can wrap, and that it's really, to me, the teams that I know that are using it, their claim to fame is that they can finally run all their CI locally exactly the same way as they run it everywhere else. And even though I'm sure CodeFresh probably has, I'm guessing, a local runner command, and other CIs have that.
Except GitHub Actions doesn't. You can do it, but you have to download a 60 gig Docker image. That still doesn't
a problem.
Everything. It's kind of difficult. That's what
it is a problem.
Actions.
I feel like it's one of those tools that the teams I know that use it, it's because they have 5 different CIs and they don't have the power to consolidate. So this is like their workaround to consolidation. So go check out Dagger. But
yeah, and I think that question of integrating, I mean, hey, if you're having Dagger make a Git commit, Argo CD is going to pick it up. You're done. So I don't think you necessarily need any direct calls, but you can, of course, hit the API, and there's pretty good documentation, Swagger documentation for hitting the API if you need to. And if you just want to run a container, we have those steps available in the codefresh.io/steps. There's like containers that are available that you can just run to run commands against Argo.
Right. Yeah, I don't even teach Dagger in the course on GitHub Actions because it's one of those things where like,
and it's brand new.
Yeah, it's brand new, and they've pivoted a time or two. I haven't even had them on the show because I want to make sure that whenever we have them on the show in 6 months, it's not irrelevant. And they're kind of trying to figure out the space, but I feel like it's one of those problems, maybe like rollouts, where you have to have a lot of pain in order to convince someone to wrap their CI in another CI, essentially. It's a problem you maybe don't have. Real quick, Argo CD is deployed using Helm. Can you tell us all the ways you can deploy Argo?
Yeah, you can deploy it using plain manifest. You can deploy it using customize. You can deploy it using Helm. Red Hat has an operator. CodeFresh has an installer. Argo CD autopilot, it lets you do it with a command line. So all those options are available. The Helm chart is technically not maintained by Argo. It's actually a community maintained project, but it's very good. They've done a ton of work on it in the last year, so it's quite excellent now. So if you're doing Terraform plus the Helm chart to like bootstrap stuff, that's a great pattern that I've seen. And I'll throw a link to a talk that we had on the stream a little while ago where some users were explaining how they integrate Terraform and Argo CD and the approach that they take. And I actually thought it was quite good. I was very impressed with how they structured it, and it made a lot of sense. So I'll throw that link into the chat.
Oh, okay.
It's Tigris. Yeah. Tigris Data is the one that did it. I'm sorry, it is gated, but there you go.
Perfect. All right. I always test everything locally first. Is there an easy way to point Argo at a local Git repo branch? Not local on your machine, but I run Argo CD on my local Docker desktop Kubernetes all the time to test Argo things, and it can look at your feature branch in the cloud. It is also something where you can just, if you don't want to have it pointed to a repo branch, and you just want to have Kubernetes, like if you want to just apply changes to Argo locally, you can still. I mean, Argo itself is, all those tools are Kubernetes workloads. They get deployed into Kubernetes through Kubernetes commands. So
yeah, what I was showing with my local cluster, for example, is kind of what I do, which is I'll work directly against my local cluster, but I'll have Argo CD there monitoring and showing me, so I get the diff of changes and stuff. And so that helps me know, if something goes wrong and I need to reset it, I can just resync it and override everything back to where it was. So I find it really helpful in that capacity. But, you're not checking in changes when you're working on it locally. So you don't want that to be the source of truth. You want it to be your reset option, to get your development environment back to where it's supposed to be.
I mean, maybe this is a little longer discussion, but there is I want to make more documentation, and this is actually going to be implemented in my training course, but the pull request generator for application set
that's awesome.
might also be, Ryan. I know you're really specifically asking local, but there is this wonderful idea for temporary environments or Epic based or PR based environments where you want to spin everything up. There is something, look up pull request generator in the Argo documentation, or just Argo CD pull request generator. Chat. Yeah, perfect. Actually, I need, if you're throwing links in chat, I'm going to make
They're probably not showing up, huh?
Yeah, I'm going to make you, can I make you moderator? Add as moderator. So now, anyway, the links should now work if you want to try to put those in there again. It blocks links from everybody by default. There we go. The PR generator is something you might look at. Although, I mean, the fact that Ryan's got me thinking now about, could I run, what's the easiest way to run Git T or something else locally that actually has a Git endpoint and a web interface that I could then point Argo to? I've never actually done that. I don't know anyone that's asked for it, but hey, someone just asked, so maybe that's a thing. And I think we've just about got all the questions. I appreciate everyone hanging out and being patient on answering the questions, because quite frankly, Dan and I could talk about this all day. So we did have one question on any coupon codes for the courses. I guess we're talking about the GitOps certification courses?
Yeah, the GitOps certification. No coupon codes today. But I would follow the CodeFresh events, because we do sometimes give them away. We actually gave one away earlier this week at a session that was for a pretty good discount. But it's also pretty cheap. I mean, as far as certifications go, it could probably be priced at $800, but instead it's like $79 when you buy both of them together.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's pretty good.
Cheap, so,
especially when you get the virtual environment kind of stuff like that.
Hosting a lab for people.
Yeah, that's awesome, and that makes it so much easier for learning on your iPad or whatever device you have in front of you. Well, thank you all so much. You're welcome, Ryan. Thank you everyone for being here. Dan, how can we follow you? You're on Twitter. How can we get the Dan updates?
On Twitter,
or
today
X,
was awesome.
Or whatever it's
LinkedIn,
called.
sometimes I post there as well. And then I mentioned that we have a GitOps Champions Discord for people that do the certification. So that's another great place to talk. And then CNCF Slack, I'm there if you need to DM me.
Perfect. There's for everyone watching in this YouTube video, just scroll down the description. There's a bunch of links to CodeFresh, to Dan's stuff, to Argo stuff. Check out all those, and follow them on the socials wherever you get your news. I don't even know whether to call this Twitter or X anymore. I'm so confused. Like
whatever. I'm gonna wait like a month. With the way that Elon goes, tomorrow it'll be called Dogecoin.
Yeah.
I mean,
we'll be back at Dodge.
Whatever.
Yeah. So maybe LinkedIn, which I'm actually spending. I find that I'm actually spending less time on Twitter and more on LinkedIn. As long as you can get past all of the recruiter ads, you'll be fine. There's a lot of really great content being shared on LinkedIn right now. So I feel like, especially around Kubernetes, GitOps, containers, all the things. So maybe we will see you all over there. Well, thank you again, Dan. It's been far too long to have you on the show. I can't wait. We're definitely going to have you back because this is a hot topic, and we need to do more demos. Clearly.
Yeah, thank you, Bret. I appreciate it. I'd love to.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for being here. Again, we're live the next couple of weeks. Nirmal will be back as my co-host next week. We're going to have more guests. We have a packed schedule. I still think we haven't put the calendar link in the description, but we have a calendar. We've got a whole bunch of other tooling all around this container space for the next couple of months. It's already booked out. So come back on Thursdays. If you didn't know, you can subscribe to the newsletter at bret.news that will tell you each week about what we're doing and who's going to be on the show. I just posted to this week's today before the show, so you had like a total of a 20-minute notice. So that was I was slacking on the newsletter this week. But you can find out bret.news. You can watch on YouTube, like and subscribe, all those things. And we will see you all next time here on YouTube. Bye.